for so long has been equal between men and women. It took a little bit longer with the venting, but not that much.
Princess Anne has always played by the rules, loyal to the crown, immune to drama, and unshakably committed to duty. But there's one thing she's never been willing to do: pretend. Not for the cameras, not for the public, and certainly not for Camilla. Behind the palace walls, where appearances are everything, Anne's quiet resistance has spoken louder than words ever could. She hasn't needed to raise her voice. Her silence, measured, deliberate, and unforgiving, has said it all. This isn't the kind of feud tabloids salivate over. There's no shouting, no scandalous headlines, just a cold, steady distance that stretches back decades, built not on one explosive event, but on years of unresolved betrayal. Because long before Camilla became queen consort, she was someone else, entirely someone connected to the very man Anne once held close. And while the public may have moved on, embracing Camilla's redemption arc and rewriting history in glossy magazine spreads, Anne never joined them. She remembers what really happened, and she's never looked away. They stand side by side at royal engagements, exchanging practiced smiles and brief glances. But anyone paying attention knows the truth. Anne doesn't trust easily, and she doesn't forget. Camilla may have earned a crown, but in Anne's eyes, she never earned her place. Not in the family, not in the institution, not after everything. And now, as King Charles pushes forward with his vision for a modern monarchy, the tension that simmered quietly for years is becoming harder to contain. With power shifting and the royal spotlight more intense than ever, the cracks that the family once hid behind tradition and protocol are starting to show. Because what divides Anne and Camilla isn't just history, it's values. It's the battle between inherited discipline and carefully crafted redemption. Between someone born into royalty and someone who had to fight sometimes ruthlessly to become part of it. The palace may still be standing, but behind its doors, a reckoning is unfolding. And it begins not with a scandal, but with a silence that refuses to be ignored. Before Camilla ever entered the royal sphere, there was someone else who stirred the heart of Princess Anne, a man who would become the quiet architect of decades-long tension, heartbreak, and unspoken loyalties. His name was Andrew Parker Bowles. Handsome, confident, and deeply embedded in the upper echelons of British society, Andrew wasn't just a fleeting love interest. He was, for a time, the man Anne saw herself building a future with. But their romance, which bloomed in the early 1970s, carried the heavy weight of centuries-old royal tradition. Andrew, a Catholic, was barred by the Ancient and Yielding Act of Settlement of 1701, a decree that forbade any royal in the line of succession from marrying a Catholic. The rule was ironclad. Love was irrelevant. Heritage and monarchy would always come first. Still, Anne and Andrew didn't let go easily. Their connection wasn't some palace fling. It was rooted in genuine affection, deep understanding, and shared social circles. In a different world, perhaps they would have defied protocol. But in Anne's world, duty was not just a principle. It was law. So, when it became clear that marriage was not only improbable, but impossible, the romance faded not from lack of love, but from the cruel clarity of royal law. What followed was not dramatic heartbreak, not public mourning, but a quiet, soul-deep fracture that Anne carried with her in silence. And as she swallowed that loss, history took a cruel turn. In a move that would come to define the tangled personal histories of the royal family, Andrew married Camilla Shand. Yes, that Camilla. The same woman who, years later, would capture the heart of Prince Charles, Anne's brother. It was a twist that none of them could have predicted, yet it tied their lives together in a knot that even time couldn't fully undo. Anne, ever composed and resolute, said nothing publicly. But those who knew her well, those who watched her become more guarded, more precise, more unyielding, understood that something had been lost. When Andrew stood at the altar with Camilla, it wasn't just the end of Anne's romantic hopes. It was the beginning of something more complicated. A triangle not just of love, but of memory, rivalry, and royal identity. Yet despite it all, Anne didn't erase Andrew from her life. In fact, she kept him close, perhaps too close for comfort. She chose him to be the godfather of her daughter, Zara Tyndall, a role of honor, trust, and symbolic permanence. It was a decision that raised eyebrows, stirred whispers, and hinted at a bond that had never truly broken. Through decades of royal upheaval, Anne and Andrew maintained a friendship that defied expectations. He wasn't just a relic of her past, he remained a quiet presence in her world. A reminder of what might have been, and for Camilla, who had once married Anne's great love, only to later wed Anne's brother, the emotional terrain was anything but simple. Though never openly addressed, this undercurrent would haunt every public appearance, every carefully managed interaction between the two women. Because while Anne buried her heartbreak in duty, Camilla was just beginning her long and controversial journey into the royal family, and the consequences of that journey would reach far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Camilla's path into the royal family was never paved with gold. It was jagged, unforgiving, and marred with controversy at every turn. Long before she wore a crown, she was labeled the woman who didn't belong, the outsider who disrupted a royal fairy tale. Her relationship with Prince Charles began not with scandal, but with an undeniable connection. He was young, impressionable, and drawn to her quiet strength. She, in turn, offered him the kind of emotional grounding his world rarely allowed. But this bond, deep, complex, and sincere, was never given a chance to flourish openly. The monarchy had other plans for the heir to the throne, and Camilla, with her past, her independence, and her sharp wit, did not fit their blueprint. She was, in the eyes of the establishment, unsuitable. And so, their love was buried beneath royal expectations, duty-bound arrangements, and the blinding spectacle of a marriage that never should have happened. When Prince Charles married Princess Diana, the world rejoiced, but behind closed doors, the shadows lengthened. Camilla, now married to Andrew Parker Bowles, watched as the man who once adored her now stood beside a woman he barely knew. Diana, adored by the public, beautiful and vulnerable, instantly became a global icon. Camilla, in contrast, was cast. In a far darker light, the other woman, the interloper, the homewrecker. She didn't speak. She didn't defend. She endured. But the damage was done. Public perception hardened like concrete, and for years Camilla was a name spoken only with disdain. Yet the web grew more twisted. Her husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, wasn't just her husband, he was also the man Princess Anne once loved. Their history, silent but significant, added another layer to the already complicated royal entanglement. Anne had never voiced bitterness, but her cool demeanor around Camilla was no secret. With every royal engagement, every shared event, the unspoken tension grew. It wasn't just a matter of status or affection, it was a collision of deeply personal pasts. Camilla hadn't just married a man Anne once cherished, she would eventually become her sister-in-law. The irony was brutal. The palace, a place of order and tradition, now housed a storm of old flames, strained alliances, and silent rivalries. But Camilla didn't vanish under the weight of public hatred. Slowly, she began to reshape the narrative. She threw herself into quiet service, aligning with charitable causes that spoke to real people. She avoided spectacle, shunned sympathy, and instead chose steady, invisible work, day after day, year after year. She walked into hospitals, sat with victims, listened to stories that never made the front pages. And somewhere along the line, the public started to see her differently. Not as the villain, but as a woman who had endured. Not as the scandal, but as someone who was still standing. Her image, once shattered, began to recover not through PR spin, but through perseverance. While she slowly carved a space for herself in a world that had once rejected her, Princess Anne stood unchanged, stoic, tireless, and unwavering in her devotion to the crown. Anne didn't adapt, she remained the embodiment of royal tradition. And though Camilla's efforts were gaining traction, Anne's shadow still loomed large. Because while one woman was redefining her role, the other had never once questioned hers. And in that contrast, the quiet war between them only deepened. Princess Anne was born into a role she never once questioned. Camilla stepped into hers with the world stacked against her. One was molded by centuries of tradition, raised to carry the monarchy's weight on her shoulders without flinching. The other had to carve out her place inch by inch, rebuilding her reputation from ruins, always walking the thin line between redemption and rejection. While the world watched the royal family with fascination, few realized the quiet, relentless divide unfolding between its two most enduring women, one defined by duty, the other by adaptation. Anne didn't ask for praise, and she didn't chase attention. For decades, she became the monarchy's silent engine. No frills, no theatrics, just action. Year after year, event after event, she kept the royal calendar ticking like clockwork. Even when others faltered, Anne didn't waver. She worked more engagements than anyone else in the family, often without cameras, without headlines. Her sense of service was absolute, her discipline unshakable. In the eyes of palace staff, she was a force. In the eyes of the public, she was a rock. There was no reinvention, no rebranding, because Anne never felt the need to become something she wasn't. She already knew exactly who she was. Camilla's journey was the opposite, unpredictable, painful, and impossibly public. From the moment she re-emerged beside Charles after the tragedy of Diana, she faced a wall of scrutiny that would have crushed most. But instead of crumbling, she recalibrated. She didn't try to become another Diana, she leaned into her own identity, slowly shifting the narrative. Through careful media appearances, relatable causes, and a measured public presence, she chipped away at old perceptions. She smiled more. She listened more. And most of all, she stayed. Over time, her survival became her strength. Yet, with every gain, she knew there were still eyes that hadn't forgotten, and some that never would. The contrast between the two women only became sharper with time. Where Anne preferred military charities, agricultural events, and no-nonsense diplomacy, Camilla embraced literacy programs, women's issues, and mental health awareness. Anne followed the letter of protocol with military precision. Camilla brought a softer, more personal touch, sometimes breaking from script, often bringing humor into rooms once cold with formality. Their differences weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. In joint appearances, Anne would offer a firm handshake. Camilla would lean in for warmth. Anne was brisk, efficient, already moving to the next engagement. Camilla lingered, aware that every moment shaped her public redemption. They were working toward the same goal, but taking completely different roads. Behind palace walls, those differences began to weigh heavier. It wasn't animosity, it was philosophy. Anne believed the crown survived by preserving what had always worked. Camilla believed it could only endure by evolving. Their approaches weren't just a reflection of personality. They were a reflection of what the monarchy itself had become, a house divided between tradition and transformation. And while neither woman would ever voice these tensions aloud, they hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. But even the deepest contrasts must eventually collide. As King Charles prepared for a new chapter in royal leadership, the quiet dissonance between his sister and his wife was no longer something the family could ignore. Because soon, everything would come to a head, and the very future of the monarchy would depend on how these two women chose to navigate the storm that was coming next. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, not in a room so quiet, not with so few people present, and certainly not with words that would echo through the very foundation of the monarchy. But something had shifted. The unspoken tension that had simmered for years was finally too loud to ignore. And when Princess Anne walked into that private royal meeting, she didn't come to be diplomatic. She came to be honest. Her tone was calm, but her message was razor-sharp. For Anne, this wasn't about personal opinion or lingering bitterness. This was about duty, the only currency she had ever trusted. And she believed, without hesitation, that the title of Queen Consort demanded more than ceremony and charm. It required sacrifice, grit, a lifetime of unwavering service. And in her eyes, Camilla hadn't earned it. What followed wasn't a shouting match. Anne didn't need to raise her voice. Her words carried the weight of decades spent in uniform, in motion, in silent obedience to the crown. She had been loyal when others faltered. She had worked when others rested. She had protected the monarchy from scandal, from softness, from the rot of mediocrity. And now, as Charles sat between his sister and his wife, he was forced to confront a truth he had avoided for too long. Anne wasn't just challenging Camilla's role, she was questioning the future of the monarchy under a woman she believed lacked the steel required to wear the crown. Camilla listened in silence, her hands folded, her posture composed. But the sting was unmistakable. These weren't attacks from the press or jeers from the public. These were words spoken behind palace walls by a woman who had always kept her emotions locked behind royal protocol until now. Charles, torn between blood and bond, tried to ease the pressure. He spoke of progress, of changing times, of Camilla's growth and contribution. He reminded Anne that public sentiment was slowly warming, that Camilla had weathered the storm and remained by his side through scandal and silence. But Anne didn't flinch. She wasn't moved by sentiment, and she didn't believe in forgiveness earned through optics. Her loyalty was to the institution, not the individuals inside it. And if that meant challenging the choices of her own brother, so be it. Camilla had done the work, yes, but Anne believed the work had come too late. That a lifetime of preparation couldn't be replaced by a decade of rehabilitation. That the damage once done could not be erased by carefully curated appearances or softened headlines. And in that room, beneath the gold trim and history-soaked walls, Camilla finally saw the full force of Anne's disapproval. It wasn't theatrical. It was deeper than anger. It was disappointment. The kind that doesn't need to be shouted to be felt. Charles sat in quiet distress, a king caught between two truths: the woman he loved and the sister who never let emotion interfere with judgment. The confrontation didn't end with resolution. It ended with silence, a silence that said more than any royal statement ever could. But while the tension in that room lingered like a storm that refused to pass, the monarchy outside was already shifting. The world was watching different faces now. New voices were rising, and in the shadow of that confrontation, a younger generation was preparing to step forward, reshaping not just the public's perception, but the very heartbeat of the royal family itself. While the monarchy wrestled with history's weight and internal fractures, a new force quietly emerged, one not forged in scandal or centuries-old traditions, but in grace, restraint, and the rare ability to connect with a modern world. Catherine, Princess of Wales, didn't storm the gates of public favor. She earned it, one deliberate step at a time. In a royal landscape still scarred by past controversies and divided loyalties, Catherine became something unexpected, a unifier. With her calm presence, genuine warmth, and unshakable composure, she began to capture hearts not through headlines, but through consistency. Where others fought to escape their pasts, Catherine built a future, and the world took notice. As Camilla battled the long shadows of public skepticism and fought to prove her place beside the king, Catherine slipped into royal life like she was born for it. But she wasn't. She came from a middle-class family, with no titles, no pedigree, and no expectations of power. And that's what made her extraordinary. The public saw themselves in her real, grounded, approachable. Every gesture, every speech, every engagement seemed to echo the values they longed to see in royalty again. She wasn't reinventing the monarchy with controversy or calculated moves. She was doing it with subtlety and sincerity. And in that contrast, the royal family found its most powerful transformation. The comparisons were inevitable and brutal. While Camilla struggled for years to reframe her narrative, Catherine was embraced almost instantly. The same press that once hounded Charles and Camilla with venom now flooded headlines with praise for Catherine's elegance, her motherhood, her sense of duty. She wasn't trying to erase the past. She was simply redefining the present. And it worked. Her approval ratings soared. Her appearances drew crowds. Her causes, particularly in early childhood development and mental health, became national conversations. Suddenly, the monarchy wasn't just enduring, it was evolving. And the symbol of that shift wasn't the Queen Consort. It was the Princess of Wales. But behind the scenes, this rise didn't come without tension. Catherine's growing influence created subtle, almost invisible tremors within the palace. Her bond with the late queen had been strong. Her relationship with King Charles appeared respectful, but distant. And as her popularity continued to climb, whispers began to surface. Was the future of the monarchy already shifting away from its present rulers? Did the public already see Catherine and William as the true center of royal stability? Camilla, despite her efforts, could feel the air changing. Once again, someone else's image was eclipsing her own. And this time, there was no scandal to blame, no history to revise. Catherine wasn't winning the public through strategy. She was doing it by being herself. Inside the royal household, loyalties were slowly adjusting. Staff, advisors, even senior royals began to sense the shift. Catherine wasn't just a rising star, she was becoming the model of what the monarchy needed to survive in a world that had grown tired of spectacle and weary of tradition. She represented something real, something fresh, something future-facing. And that influence, quiet but undeniable, began to shape everything around her. But even as her star continued to rise, the deeper story remained of bonds once broken, of alliances still fragile, and of a monarchy forever caught between what it was and what it must become. Because while the crown may rest on Charles's head, and Camilla may sit beside him, it's the next chapter and the people writing it that will determine how this story ends. Princess Anne and Queen Camilla, two women bound by the same institution but driven by very different truths, have shared a history so entangled it has quietly shaped the very air within royal walls. Time has passed, public roles have evolved, and titles have changed. But behind every formal exchange and photo op, echoes of their past continue to ripple through the present. The story may not have been told outright, but it lingers in the silence between glances, in the distance they keep, and in the roles they've both come to represent. Their relationship was never marked by confrontation, but by what was never said. Anne, with her unwavering dedication to tradition, never openly challenged Camilla in public. But her restraint spoke volumes. For decades, Anne carried the burden of her own heartbreak, watching the man she once loved marry a woman who would later take her mother's place beside the throne. Camilla, too, carried her own weight, never quite accepted, never fully embraced, always aware that she had stepped into a royal house where loyalty had already chosen its sides. These unspoken stories of sacrifice, of bitterness, of calculated survival now shape every interaction between them. The result is a bond not built on warmth, but on endurance. They have learned to coexist, to walk parallel paths without ever truly meeting in the middle. And yet, their history has not remained locked in the past. It has seeped into the very fabric of the monarchy. The dynamic between them cool, distant, fragile mirrors the institution they serve. An institution that, for all its formality and ceremony, is held together not by affection, but by obligation. Anne's skepticism of Camilla was never just personal, it was symbolic. It reflected a deeper fear that tradition could be eroded, by sentiment that the crown could become more about image than integrity. Camilla's rise, though hard-won, challenged the royal code Anne had lived by her entire life. And in that conflict, silent, unresolved lies a story that continues to affect the monarchy's public perception. To the outside world, their differences are barely visible. But inside the palace, they resonate. Staff, aides, and insiders have long noticed the subtle imbalances: who stands where, who speaks first, who receives more press attention, who commands deeper respect behind closed doors. It's not always about hierarchy. Sometimes it's about legacy. And Anne's legacy, rooted in quiet duty, is hard to compete with. Camilla has earned her place, yes, but she has never fully escaped the shadow of how she got there. As a result, every joint engagement, every family gathering, is colored by a history that was never allowed to fade. And so, the monarchy moves forward, but always with these quiet storms swirling beneath the surface. In a world where public figures are scrutinized down to the smallest gesture, even the absence of emotion can become a story. The silence between Anne and Camilla, once personal, is now political. And as future generations rise to prominence, they will inherit not just crowns and titles, but the lingering aftershocks of unresolved tensions. Because even in a palace built on ceremony, it is the private truths that often leave the most lasting marks. The monarchy may stand tall in the spotlight, but its most fragile truths remain hidden in the shadows of the past, waiting for the next chapter to reveal what the crown dares not say aloud. As the nation stood still to remember the sacrifices of a generation long gone, the 80th anniversary of VE Day arrived not with quiet reflection, but with thunderous pageantry. The skies roared with the sound of fighter jets. The ground trembled beneath the synchronized footsteps of 1,300 troops, and the eyes of millions turned to Buckingham Palace. But this year felt different. It wasn't just the grandeur or the numbers. It was the absence that defined it, the first major VE Day commemoration without Queen Elizabeth II. Her reign, deeply entwined with the legacy of war and recovery, had always been a guiding presence on days like this. But now, the throne stood in transition, and the future had taken center stage. In her place stood King Charles, dignified and resolute, flanked by the next generation. And it was here, in this exact setting of tradition and tribute, that the unexpected happened. While history marched in uniform before the gates of royalty, a quiet exchange off to the side stole the world's heart. It wasn't part of the ceremony. It wasn't in the program. It was just a whisper. Princess Charlotte, leaning in to share a secret with her younger brother, Prince Louis. Whatever she said, it worked. A grin spread across his face, the kind of grin that can't be faked. And in that one moment, the entire tone shifted. Suddenly, the war memorial wasn't just a backdrop for political statements or military honors, it became a stage for humanity. Because in the midst of discipline and remembrance, the royal children offered something else: balance. Their innocence didn't diminish the solemnity of the day. It elevated it. Their laughter didn't distract from the legacy being honored. It refreshed it. And for royal watchers around the world, it was proof that the monarchy, though rooted in history, was learning to breathe differently, to feel differently, to exist in a world where sincerity was becoming more valuable than ceremony. What many noticed and praised wasn't the grandeur of the march or the size of the procession. It was the way these children, effortlessly and without awareness, brought warmth to a cold tradition. It was in how Prince George bowed slightly to a veteran, in how Princess Charlotte straightened her posture when her mother glanced over, in how Prince Louis, just moments after brushing his father's shoulder, looked around with wide, eager eyes, not to impress, but to understand. They weren't props. They weren't ornaments of power. They were participants. And that mattered because, in a world that has grown skeptical of crowns and bloodlines, gestures like these speak louder than royal decrees. They show a monarchy that no longer survives solely by the weight of its legacy, but by the emotional connection it builds with the people it serves. And so, while the military marched and the RAF flew overhead, something else was rising beneath the surface. A new kind of heroism. One that doesn't wear medals, but offers moments. One that doesn't fight wars, but heals divides with empathy and authenticity. Which brings us to the deeper question: what does this say about the royal family today? Not just as figureheads of a fading empire, but as people, as parents, as children, as symbols redefined not by their history, but by how deeply they're willing to feel. Because what happened that day wasn't just a tribute to the past. It was a glimpse of the future, and it looked remarkably, refreshingly human. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.